Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
All right, well, welcome back, Whole Pineapple listeners. We are so thrilled to have Sean Tipton with us again. Hopefully you listened to his full episode with his very impressive bio on all his advocacy work and multiple years in the reproductive space. And we kind of covered in the main episode what are the challenges post-OBS decision and how IVF may be impacted. But on this episode, we really want to talk about how individuals can get involved. You know, at the end of that one, we kind of said, a lot of us, this is something we never wanted to do, to have to work on advocacy, especially post-pandemic. Everybody's tired. Everyone just wants to get back to quote unquote normal. And this is just one more thing that makes the whole world feel abnormal. But we're hoping we can get some concrete tips on what can we as people that are not professional lobbyists do to try and make our voices heard? So welcome back.
Well, thanks. And I think that's a great question and a great kind of thematic message. I think the most important thing is to recognize your First Amendment right to petition the government for redress of grievances and to use that to give you some confidence that you have the right, if not the obligation, to be involved in the policy process. And I think on a very practical level, what should you do? You should register to vote. You should vote. You should attend candidate forums and communicate with people when they're running for office is the best time to have them listen to you. If you own or work at an infertility clinic, you should invite policymakers and their staff to your clinic. I mean, there's what's the cliche? Politicians love kissing babies. Well, an infertility clinic presents a target-rich environment for that, right? So, so do that. In a state legislative district, an infertility clinic of any size is going to be a substantial employer, right? So they have some reasons to want to listen to you. And so I think it's just I have a right to do this. I have a right to be heard. And I have some information that is important to policymakers. They're going to be making some decisions that affect reproductive medicine. And if you're a patient or a provider, you have a perspective and some information that can be useful to policymakers as they're making those decisions. And don't think you have to be an expert, right? This is not just for physicians and healthcare providers. This is for patients and other people involved in the clinic and family members. One of the clashes I see between the cultures of science and the culture of politics is scientists have this idea that empirical data ought to be the only thing driving decisions. And maybe that should be, but it's not how it is, right? Stories really, really matter. Personal stories really matter. Faces really matter. So if you listen to politicians on the stump, they don't just say, here's my policy on unemployment. They say, I was talking to a woman in Lakeville yesterday, and she is going through this. And here's how my policy stances will help that woman, right? So you can see the power of the personal story for politicians all the time. So provide them that fodder. Right? You can say, I was talking to a young couple in my district and they're struggling to have children and it's hard for them to get the medical care that they need, which exists. They just can't access it. And here's how my policy stance is going to help them access those treatments. So anecdotes and emotion are tremendously important. And that's what you bring to the table.
And how do you get your story in front of someone? I mean, it can seem so overwhelming. A lot of people don't even know who their representative is.
This is why jobs like mine exist, right? If you're a professional and you're involved in your professional organization, certainly if you're an ASRM member, you call our office, we're going to help you get going, right? We work with Resolve, the patient group, and do a big advocacy day every year, explicitly trying to get people some experience in doing this.
And I know the website for Resolve makes it really easy. You can type in your zip code. It'll be like, hey, here are your people. Here's the contact information for their offices. So they do make it easy, and you don't have to feel like you failed high school civics. You can just kind of remind yourself on who you need to talk to.
Right. We'll do that. Resolve will do that, and that happens in other spaces. I mean, there's literally an industry. We, for example, at our annual meeting in New Orleans in the fall, we're going to have an advocacy is everywhere campaign, and we're going to have stations one day. And one of those stations is going to be a place to come and see if you're registered to vote, if not, how to get registered to vote, and who all your elected representatives are from city council to president. So we're going to try to help provide some tools for that. And that's what we do. And that's what groups like ours do. And so there's lots of places to get help and to get going. What I said a minute ago, that during election season is the time to do it. They're all on social media. They're all got websites. They will say where they're going to be. Show up and ask them some questions.
It is interesting mentioning ASRM's meeting in Louisiana, because I know that was, a topic, and with all these things coming up, and we talked in our main episode about how Louisiana's had restrictive laws that do affect IVF. I know there was conversation about, well, should we even be supporting a state? And, how do you, when ASRM is there for the annual meeting, is there advocacy work that's going to be happening as part of the meeting as well?
For those that don't know, ASRM is huge.
It's a huge conference. It's a big economic driver.
I'm going this year and I'm already a little overwhelmed because there's so much that happens there. So
yeah, we put on a fairly big meeting and we bring some money into town. And we thought long and hard about this, and our board asked a lot of questions, and we talked to a lot of people, most importantly, including activists on the ground there. And one of the conclusions we came to was to withdraw the meeting and move it somewhere else is only going to hurt the people who are already hurt already. So who are the people who work in the hospitality industry, right? It's predominantly female, it's predominantly people of color. And so if you pull that out, it's not, the owner of the Hyatt is not going to notice necessarily if we're not there, but the cooks who don't get those extra shifts, that's going to make a difference to them. So that was a big part of it. And the other reality is legislators in Louisiana aren't going to care if we move our meeting. We don't vote there. They're not going to care. But the biggest thing is, at this point, we're the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. We're not the states who have favorable laws society for reproductive medicine. So we are not prepared to abandon our members, or more importantly, their patients, in the now majority of states who restrict reproductive care.
It brings the attention back to the conversation too. Like, hey, this meeting is happening in Louisiana. And it just kind of points that at what's happening nationwide right now too.
You have to have your meetings somewhere other than the East or West Coast.
We can't just rotate between Maryland and California.
Correct.
And just go back and forth. So for people that do work in healthcare, is it best if you're kind of talking as part of a professional organization? You're like, I'm from ASRM or this and that, or is it better to still share just your individual stories kind of in that same more personal way? Because I just struggle too. Like, I don't know if I'm more helpful as a professional or more helpful as a fertility patient, talking about my own experience and why this is so important to me personally as well as in my job.
You're who you are and you have the experiences that you've had. So both of those are valid things to be talking about, right? I think where organizations like mine can help people is we can help you find the right people to talk to. We spend a lot of time thinking about our messages, right? So we have that going. And timing is also real important, right? So we have a somewhat different style than the patient groups do, for example. I don't like to panic our members, right? And to have them spin their wheels for the sake of process, right? So you're not going to hear from us, hey, contact your member on some vague thing. We're going to be like, this bill is happening right now, today, pick up the damn phone and call. And so we need people to respond to that, because we really are careful about not doing that lightly. But at the same time, I think people do have to be willing to get involved in something like, again, I'm not an abortion provider, therefore I don't need to talk about this. And I don't think you can afford that luxury anymore. I think if you're in healthcare, you have to protect the right for healthcare providers to do their work without political interference, regardless of what field of medicine you happen to work in. Because if people can decide that abortion is immoral and should be illegal, there's no reason they can't decide that fixing a broken femur is that way too. Right? I mean, they probably won't, but once you let that right go, then there's no stopping it.
And is trying to talk in person better than letters? I just think back to forever ago when I was in college. I did a semester in DC and I was more on the public health side, but I had friends that worked on the Hill and they're like, yeah, that was my job as an intern, is I just kind of sorted all these random emails from kind of like the crackpots about whatever was the topic of the day, and they just kind of tally yay or nay. But I don't feel like those were necessarily heard. Is there a certain way of trying to communicate that's better than others?
I will say this, that legislative officials and their staff get pretty good at recognizing how much work has gone into something, right? So they know to treat differently. I mean, it used to be a postcard, right? And so, if it's an email where they forget to, where it comes out, put your name here, and that still shows up in the email, right? I mean, people see that and they get it. I do think there's a recognition for how much work you're doing. And, 90% of life is showing up. So if suddenly every time they do a town hall, there's somebody there asking about infertility access, they're going to start to wonder what the hell's going on, and maybe they should pay attention to it. And one thing I think to be mindful of is, while I appreciate anybody who retweets any of ASRM tweets about any legislative issue, don't kid yourself into thinking that's doing just a whole lot. It's something. It has some value, and I would prefer to be retweeting to being ignored, but don't think that that is the same as inviting the staff member for a state legislator to your clinic.
Another good point, I think, is when we talk about sharing stories, that it's not just sharing stories with the people that are maybe passing law and policy, but with other voters. I think a lot of people, when they've gone through IVF, that's inherently kind of a pretty personal decision. Politicians want grandchildren too as well. And so if maybe you are in one of these more conservative states and you have a lot of family members that are super happy with the bans that have been passed, and they may not quite understand how policy can impact reproductive rights, then you telling your story about how you did fertility treatment and what's involved in IVF and how a ban that defines life as the moment of conception is going to really, limit the kind of things that you did. I think that can sometimes make a difference in terms of how other people might vote.
That is such a great point, and one of the issues with infertility has been the stigma and people unwilling to talk about it. And at this point, the threats are such that we have to get over that. It can be a little bit uncomfortable, but you know what? A little bit of discomfort is good, because if people don't realize that the policies they are articulating have harmful impacts, then there's no reason for them to think about it. So I think you have to articulate why this is a problem. Literally, people are shocked to learn, wait a minute, this bill that's going to stop abortion is also going to hurt IVF. I don't understand how that could be. And they don't want that. You have to articulate that for them and say, I get you want to protect little babies. I'm just trying to let people have little babies, right? We can talk about abortion another day.
A lot of people, what they show their support is with their dollar, with their money, right? So is there a best way to do that? Is there somewhere where you know that your money is going to the place that's going to have the most impact?
Well, ASRM will gladly take your money. We've got
Oh, great.
I mean, we established a reproductive care protection fund after the Dobbs decision, and that helped us in the fall of 2022. There were 5 ballot measures about abortion rights. We ran ads in all 5 of those states, and we won in all 5 states. Now, we weren't the only reason that they won, but we were successful. And we're prepared. There's going to be a ballot measure in 2023 in Ohio. We're going to be doing the same thing there. We anticipate several in 2024. So that's how we put some of that money to use. I would say take your time and, and look around and think about what you want to do. Do you want to, there are some really good travel funds for people in states who can't get the care that they need. Personally, I grew up in Kentucky, and we have a condo in Kentucky, and we give to one of those funds with some regularity because that's important to us. So you got to think about what you want to try to do with your money. But let me just tell you, just like showing up and communicating with politicians, voting's great. They like your money even at least as much as they like your vote. And in a state legislative district, if you get together with 15 or 20 of your friends or fellow infertility patients, and you have a fundraising event for a state legislative candidate, they're going to notice that, and they're going to pay attention. I'm not saying that politicians can be bought just with a campaign contribution, but at least it allows you to have a dialogue. So ASRM, our tax status does not allow us to give money to candidates or to endorse candidates. But let me just tell you, myself and the rest of my government affairs team, we have lots of opinions about lots of elected officials. And we'd be happy to share those with anybody who wants them.
And I think that's a good point to realize the power that you have locally. I feel like sometimes when we're talking about big national decisions, you can feel like you have no control. But you're right, a lot of this action is happening in the state. And a lot of state houses, there are certain districts where control is a lot tighter than you might think. And like individual rallying, can make a difference. Or if someone's in a tight election, you're right, that's the best time for them to want to listen to you and understand the issues that are important, so that if they do win, you're someone that they, feel a bit more indebted to.
And it's developing the bench, it's developing the farm team, right? So a whole lot of members of Congress were state legislators first, and they're easier to get to, and they learn those lessons. If in somebody's first state legislative race, they have met with infertility patients and gotten money from them all at once, they're going to remember that their whole career.
And I think another place that people sometimes get a little hung up is like, oh, I'm just one person. I'm not going to make that much of an effect. And I think realizing that you actually do have a lot of effect, especially when you do something other than just, retweet
Scream
or
into
something.
the internet. Yeah.
Yes.
It can be really discouraging. If we had, like one of those cash jars for every time somebody dropped an F-bomb in one of my staff meetings, we would be rich, right? 2023 has led to a lot of profanity from the ASRM government affairs staff. It can really get to you after a while when you're losing again and again, but you have to fight the fight. And one of the real advantages, and I actually had an experience recently. I grew up in Kentucky. My parents were kind of liberal politicians, not with their career, but they were involved in politics. At the Pacific Coast Reproductive Meeting in Palm Springs, I met up with a guy he was a retired legislator and judge from Kentucky. He was Kentucky's first openly gay elected official. Kentucky passed a really nasty anti-trans bill this session, and he was saying he was going and talking to a fundraising thing for a transcript, and he's like, and he had an optimistic message. He reminded me that he had gotten to be friends with my parents and a bunch of other people in the 1972 presidential election, working for George McGovern in Kentucky, where they got beat by about 65 points. But out of the cadre of people working on that campaign, came my mother, who was elected to the local school board and brought in a pro-union school board for the first time ever in Kentucky. A future mayor of Lexington, Kentucky. This guy who became a state senator and a judge. So there are allies to be found by having the fight. There's solidarity to be gained by realizing you're not alone, and that what feels like a lonely action can suddenly feel a whole lot less lonely when you suddenly see hundreds of people taking it. And if nobody does it, then nothing's going to happen. It's only going to be bad if nobody does anything. And you may not achieve your policy goal the first time, but if you start getting involved and get more comfortable and bring people with you, I promise you'll have an impact. And it's important not to underestimate the importance of letting people know you're there, even if they're going to disagree with you. So you may have, a state senator that represents you because of where you live, who opposes everything that you believe in. Communicate with them anyway, because one of the things that politicians have to do all the time is gauge the level of opposition. And if they think there's nobody out there who objects to what they're doing, then they're going to be like, great, let's do more. Let's make it even stronger. On the other hand, if they're like, you know what, we really pissed those people off last time, I don't think I can do it again this year, that will make a difference. So it's easy to get discouraged, and it's important not to. And if anybody has more tricks on that, let me know, because I have to remind myself of that every single day. I mean, on the one hand, this kind of fight is why I love my job and why I get up in the morning and want to do this kind of stuff. But yeah, it can be discouraging sometimes.
That's such a good point, though.
Yeah, that's like the best closing statement ever. We'll send you the t-shirt that says, I'm here to petition my grievances. But everything else, I think, is perfect. So, but even for the beginning, you're right. That's a right. It's a right that we all have. And it's fundamental to the whole principles of our country. And it's really a responsibility to use it and not just complain to like-minded people.
So what's interesting is, as we were doing Advocacy Day with Resolve this year, there was a member of Congress, Tom Massey from Kentucky, who said he would not accept meetings from any organization that had a vaccine mandate. And I'm like, well, we don't really have ours anymore, so we're okay there. But I happen to believe that is unconstitutional.
Yeah.
So, I think if we pressed it, we could be like, you have to take this meeting. We have a constitutional right to demand that you do this meeting, regardless of where we stand.
I think that's it. I feel pumped up. I feel a lot more confident than last time.
I think we firmly went from scared to prepared over this last one. So cool.
And those are not mutually exclusive.
It's true.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's I think real important is that The way to get over being scared is to get prepared. I do a lot of public speaking. I do live media broadcasts and all kinds of forums. I've done them for a long time. If I'm not a little bit nervous before I go onto a stage or before I do an interview, I don't feel like I'm ready.
I mean, pretty much all the hard and rewarding things in life are very scary while you're doing them. You just keep doing them anyway if they're important. So
a lot of times they're scarier before you, at least for me, they're scarier before you do them. When you're actually doing them, it's like, oh, this isn't so bad.
Totally.
I hope we terrified you. I hope that this interview
We're pretty scary, Anne.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. Thanks again for all your time and your help.
You're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity and working on these issues. I really, really believe in them. I really believe in science. I really believe in families, and I really believe in the First Amendment. So I think I'm in the right place for my work.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.